Ladies and gentlemen, I had some pretty strong things to say about Enotria, the last song, the day that it released. But through some divine intervention, I ended up giving the devs time to iron out all their kinks and bring the game to where it should be. They of course didn't, because we have gathered here today to talk about the first ever Lords of the Fallen-like. And I don't mean that as a way of saying the games have similar mechanics, which they do, but rather as a way of saying that this is a game that asks for a pretty penny, but offers a shitty Lenny. This is by all means a glorified early access game masquerading as a finished product, and it could easily fool anyone. Sure fooled me. All I knew going into it, aside from my rather pleasant demo experience, is that Enotria, the last song, is a game that wants to play into Italian folklore within the confines of a challenging experience. Kinda how Neo handles Japanese folklore and history while being the pinnacle of action RPG gaming. However, Enotria, the last song, is a 50-50 on the folklore front. Like yeah, the surface level is very Italian. Everything is a play, as it's based on Commedia dell'arte, an early form of professional Italian theater. And you can buy an extremely expensive pizza. Alas, if you dive below the surface, as I typically would with a Serjuh perspective, you find that the pursuit for knowledge leads you down a path that is not pleasant to tread. But you know, that's something that can be overlooked, because at the end of the day, what matters is the combat. The bashing your head against a wall to persevere through trials and tribulations, right? Well, Enotria, the last song, is a 50-50 on this front as well. The parameters you have to create your own unique build are quite deep and very fun to tweak around. But the ops you'd use said parameters on never pierce through B tier at best, and oftentimes just congregate around D tier. But first, let us start in the beginning. Enotria, the last song, launched 2 days earlier than its intended release date, with no key remapping for both mouse and keyboard and controllers. On rare occasions, such a lacking accessibility crime can be forgiven, but the defaults the developers went with here were absolutely awful, like straight up insane Asylum SKP key combinations. This is something I have actually brought up as feedback during the demo window months before the release, so I'm glad to see that feedback went up the same hole that squeezed out the defaults to begin with. Fortunately, weeks down the line, key remapping was added for mouse and keyboard, so the game became playable without third-party applications. Controller bros unfortunately to this day are hard stuck to whatever diabolical defaults the game has. Following the remapping update, I was able to play the game and see its glowing and cracked parts. This was short-lived because the same update rolled out a baby mode. Which is whatever, right? Like, I personally do not care if a game has a journalist mode, because it's optional. But I did care in this case because every save made prior to this update defaulted to the baby mode difficulty without the option to change it. Needless to say, this move forced me to drop the game. The devs did add an option to change difficulties a day later, but it was already too late for me. Mind you, this all happened at full price with no indication that the game is an unfinished product. Well, here we are now. The roadmap for Enotria, the last song, reached its conclusion in March, and no updates were made since. The developers also seemingly completely moved on to a new project and abandoned the DLC that was promised with the Enotria, the last song, Deluxe Edition, going so far as to removing any mention of it and being opaque when talking about it. So far as I'm concerned, what we're going to talk about is the complete and definitive Enotria experience. The game starts really strong on both its relevant fronts. Mechanically, it introduces you to what you'll be utilizing throughout the game, that being attacking to deal damage, dodging to avoid damage, and parrying to both avoid damage and building up the enemy's stagger meter to harvest some free grapples once it's full. Nothing really groundbreaking or never seen before, but the parry does sound good and nicely deflects projectiles. It also introduces you to Enotria's unique mechanics, such as Ardor-related Shabling-Blings, aka the ability to get rid of anything with a gold tint to either make progress or find hidden paths, and also even create paths akin to Lord of the Fallen's Comworld transition, but without the whole boring process of pulling out the lamp, then giving it the sucky suck to be in a realm where new paths arise. Here is just a simple button press to stomp and boom, progress can be made without any needless abrasions. And the final thing we're introduced to mechanically is masks. These are the Enotria selling point, or at least one of two selling points. Everything prior you could say is derivative, but this falls in original content territory, even though it kinda resembles the concept of shells from Mortal Shell on the surface. A mask is your foundation in loadouts that come with innate benefits, stat templates of your choosing, weapons of your choosing, perks of your choosing, and active skills of your choosing. You have 3 mask slots to play around with, meaning you can run 3 completely unique builds that you can swap between faster than you can swap worlds in Lords of the Fallen. And it's not like some needless player freedom gimmick. The game is actually crafted around you being versatile and prepared for very diverse situations, as you'll come to see soon. Artistically, the opening does a great job at setting the tone and theme. It gives you an idea to whom your journey will lead for climactic battles and paints a rough understanding of why everything is the way it is. This understanding isn't rough if you're familiar with Commedia dell'arte, the core of which is canovaccio, or canvas. It is essentially a scenario for acts, scenes, and character entrances that leaves dialogues and gags to be improvised by the actors. In Enotria, this canovaccio traps everyone into fixed roles that repeat unendlessly. This gives a great in-universe explanation as to why enemies respawn when you rest at a bonfire and why they're always in the same spots, which usually is nothing more than a gameplay feature in other titles. This also adds a nice charm to enemies once you internalize that they're trapped in their role, like a lumberjack being condemned to jack the lumber eternally, or the half-eaten actor to be half-eaten. That paired with the game's dedication to play into the whole Italian folklore selling point, by the means of having a unique bonfire you strum to resonate, and more than a handful of Italian descriptors to contextualize things, makes the game feel like it was crafted with a very strong vision. Maybe even too strong at times, because skill charge speeds are conveyed via Italian, which I don't speak. I want to know if my skill will charge fast. Seeing vivace or adagio doesn't really help me with that. Maybe a little number or some icon beside it would give better context, while also simultaneously teach people that presto means fast because it has the 3 arrows up speed icon next to it. With that strong opening in mind, all the game really has to do is elaborate going forward and further nail the artistic and mechanic. For pretty much the entirety of the first region, it does a fantastic job. You get a taste of varying encounters, you get a taste of curiosity being rewarded by going off the beaten path and finding some active skill you can slot into your mask, upgrade materials, flask upgrades, or maybe even optional difficult encounters. And you get a taste of farming, as some enemies can drop their weapons and even shards of their mask that will be crafted once you collect enough of said shards. For someone like me, this is pretty much a perfect hook. There's an engaging micro gameplay loop, that being fighting a composition of varying enemies as you go through the game, and an alluring macro gameplay loop of farming/finding masks, skills, and weapons to expand your versatility. The latter of which is actually surprisingly fantastic. Each weapon archetype within Enotria comes with the typical differences. Some hit fast and deal minimal posture damage. Some hit slow and deal huge posture damage. And others exist in between. But the beauty comes from the fact that even within the same archetype, there are differences to find. The way one polearm functions is not guaranteed to be the way a different polearm functions. This could either be due to a unique moveset, an innate elemental infusion on your weapon when doing specific attacks, or a unique heavy attack. Usually you can tell when there are differences to find based on the weapon's rarity, though this is more of an indicator rather than a concrete rule. Legendary weapons will always have a completely unique moveset. The rest, being epic, rare and common, can have a unique moveset, innate elemental infusion on specific attacks, unique heavy attacks, or all of the above depending on the weapon. This is something that beautifully maintains the exciting feeling of finding a new weapon and wondering how you can integrate it into your playthrough. Maybe I shouldn't call Enotria a Lords of the Fallen-like because of that, as Lords of the Fallen is one of the most pathetic games imaginable in terms of moveset diversity, despite boasting about having hundreds of weapons. Further on the weapons point, after you decide which moveset and which focus point you want to go with, there is one more crucial thing to consider: elements. Enotria has 4 elements present in the game: Viz, Fatuo, Malano, and Gratia. Each inflicts its own unique status effect, which is where a lot of confusion arose for me throughout my playthrough. Typically, if someone applies poison on you, you're poisoned. If someone applies lightning, you're shocked or electrified. Or from a different perspective, if you're scorched, you know you've been afflicted by fire. Or if you're saturated, you know you've been afflicted by water. Very logical information to digest, right? Well, in Enotria, Viz inflicts Dizzy, which increases damage dealt and stamina regen at the cost of lowered defense. Kinda like being drunk, which goes with the element's icon. Fatuo inflicts Wicked, which increases elemental damage but also causes the attacker to heal when landing attacks on the afflicted. Malano inflicts Sickness, which is a pretty standard poison damage over time effect. And lastly, Gratia inflicts Radiant, causing the afflicted to recover health over time unless you make them pop by overflowing the status meter. This is unfortunately where Enotria starts taking a nosedive. Elements are not just some fun additional layer of effects to play around with. They are crucial the deeper into the game you go, as there will be enemies whose health bars are of a certain element color. Fighting them conventionally will more often than not be a battle of attrition, aka boring. So you are essentially forced to resort to the appropriate element. This right here is why I sometimes like and sometimes hate Enotria the Last Song. It all depends on when I'm presented with the question. If you ask me if I like the elements when I encounter an enemy whose element I have an answer for in one of my loadouts, then I will say elements are great, since it's like a puzzle. You stumble across an enemy, see their health bar, refer to the element wheel, and see that for their square hole you have a square pinar. It feels great, and it also guarantees you won't have an awfully long fight. Conversely, if you ask me the same question when I encounter an enemy whose element I do not have an answer for, then I will say this is awful, since now I'm forced to augment one of my loadouts. It could be by changing the weapon it has to one that is imbued with the element I need if A, I have it, and B, it's upgraded. If I don't have the weapon, then whoop-de-fucking-do. And if I do have the weapon, but it's not upgraded, then I'm presented with a material and currency sink. Fortunately, you can refund materials spent on upgrading weapons, minus any memoria aka souls spent. Though be very careful when refunding upgrades, as the menu can bug out with no indication and you'll actually upgrade the weapon instead of downgrading it, which can be problematic if you were attempting to refund a +9 weapon, because the refunding option is removed for weapons that hit max level. Another way I can augment my loadout is by changing up its perks to ones that give me imbues weapon with whatever element when using active skill from some specific slot, which is less efficient because you first must charge your skills in the encounter, and only then enjoy some decent damage for the duration of the imbuement, but it doesn't come with any material or currency costs. The game doesn't have elaborate world building in the sense of giving you foresight for what elements you'll be presented with in upcoming encounters. Take Mines of Gratia for example. With that name, you'd rightfully assume that running some Malano here would be a wise move because the ops have to be Gratia coded, right? Well, the first ops you encounter here will be Malano coded themselves. Matter of fact, there is only one Gratia coded enemy in this area. World building in terms of level design though is fantastic. Navigating through locations feels great, both because of the visual uniqueness each boasts and because of the elaborate shortcuts that you can find. It is often that the game pleasantly loops back to a bonfire you didn't think about or areas you've completely forgotten about. Hell, even going off the beaten path will very sexily loop you back to the main path once all its benefits have been harvested. All of that is unless the area is designed around jumping. While Enotria does have a dedicated jump button, said jump kills your momentum and feels all around terrible, especially when more precise jumps need to be made. That being said, the shortcuts do tend to be immersion breaking at times. Like we all know to expect door opens from the other side nowadays. But usually when we do get to the other side, there is some justification for the walk around involved. It could be lifting a plank, bunking a button, whatever. Here in Enotria, it's just opening said door from the other side. I don't mean to hark on this, but how am I supposed to believe my character couldn't just pull this flimsy ass gate? This also kinda extends to window design as well. There is no shortage of windows that are beyond a shadow of a doubt big enough for your character to fit in them. And there's actually content past said windows that you can see. But alas, there is an invisible wall. Little things like this in a vacuum are not an issue, but they do unfortunately stack up. Now let's take a look at loadouts. You have 3 to fool around with, and each consists of 1 or 2 weapons, a parry gem that'll mix up your parry's focus point, either being more efficient against some specific damage type, or being more about perfectionism. A mask that dictates your character's appearance and gives a strong benefit when your character is awakened, that being the state you are in after unraveling or grappling an enemy. There's around 30 masks in the game, and I have to say they all pass the vibe check visually. Masks do have a stat requirement, but they're usually not steep and can be easily negated with another thing loadouts offer: rolls. Rolls are essentially character stats that layer on top of your own stats, giving you some of XYZ stat while sometimes taking away from other stats. They also come with some innate benefit on top of that. Next we have perks. As you progress through the game and collect lore tabs, you'll be finding a specific currency that can be spent in the Path of Innovator's menu. Purple anchors on the elemental, red on health/damage, green on stamina/damage, and blue on mask lines aka skills. Other than the limited quantity you can have slotted, there are no restrictions when it comes to mixing and matching perks. So the loadout diversity can be very strong if you go for a cohesive build synergy. Mask lines are your active skills that charge up when you deal damage. They usually conjure up a basic weapon attack, but one that is imbued with some element. Though there are more than a handful of wild ones to find that provide staggers, AoE, and huge damage. Lastly, there's the hotbar where you slot throwables and the likes. All that was just mentioned changes to something completely different the moment you swap loadouts. That means you have a total of 6 weapons and 12 mask lines to play around with, which makes navigating through the already great areas even more fun, since you're disposing of whatever may come in varying and efficient ways. That is up until the inevitable boss stops you in your tracks. I'ma say it straight up, the bosses in this game are a mixed bag. The good is that from an artistic standpoint, they are fantastic. Take Zani for example. On the surface, he is just a hideous monstrosity, something that isn't too uncommon for games of this nature. But under the hood, Zani is literally Zani, a character type of Commedia dell'arte that is portrayed as always hungry amongst other things, something that is displayed wonderfully in the game. Or how about Veltha, god of strife? You might think, well, Italian game, so this is probably some Roman god. But no, Veltha is an Etruscan deity that shines light on Italian legacy that predates Roman absorption. There are many other examples of bosses derived from Commedia dell'arte and or ancient Italian heritage. But much like with Neo, the knowledge for them is locked behind a language barrier. Such is the case for Giangurgolo, for whom I couldn't find anything but an Italian wiki page. As such, I implore any Italian viewer to take the initiative and make an Italospective on Enotria that would shine light on all of these esoteric bits and nuances, because I am not going to. What I am going to do is move on to the mid. The fights with these interesting figures are often not that great. Taking Giangurgolo as an example again, you get a great parry-centric fight that has a really nice rhythm that, unfortunately, gets destroyed by an obnoxious dust visual effect every time you parry. It is so obnoxious that you often can't see what's going on, which changes the nature of parrying from a reactive one into a predictive one. Fortunately, this doesn't spell doom or anything of the sort, because Giangurgolo will spam the same move more often than not. Another such boss is Captain Spaventa. Absolutely phenomenal fight in every regard. He hits hard, but slow enough to read, he is super drippy, and around 50% health he goes into phase 2, where his polearm will act as a gun, allowing him to make some sick ass moves. So how could this lovely encounter go wrong? Well, once he dies, his armor explodes and you have to kill the real him, that runs around the arena throwing bombs at you. Keep in mind that the encounter leading up to this is quite hard and has a high likelihood of leaving you without any heals. And now you're presented with a situation where you could easily die to some flimsy firebomb trying to catch this dude, which is easier said than done. If you're smart enough to have made a loadout centered around ranged mask lines, then this isn't as terrible, since he spawns some mob you can dispatch quickly for mask charge. But that doesn't guarantee your ranged attacks will hit to begin with. Like, I get it, this Spaventa fellow represents one of the stock characters of Commedia dell'arte, a military officer full of false bravado. And the devs try to showcase that via gameplay rather than a cutscene, but I feel like there could have been a better way to handle it. Unfortunately, most bosses have some annoying factor in their encounters. With some, it evens out because of who they are, like the aforementioned, but with others, it doesn't. Like with the several copy-pasted bosses who are only differentiated by their elemental affinity.
Дай хуй потрогать.
Or the several bosses that become regular mobs pretty much instantly, as was the case in Lords of the Fallen. Speaking of Lords of the Fallen, there has not been a single Enotria session in which I did not encounter a bug or shortcoming. For the most part, these are small things like underwhelming sound effects, choppy cutscenes, visual anomalies, wonky lock-ons, subtitles staying on screen despite dialogue ending, and the aforementioned material refunding kerfuffle. However, there are also major bugs that were frequent enough for me to grow conscious of possible causes that made specific bits of gameplay feel like I'm walking on eggshells. For example, if you skip through dialogue too fast, it is very likely to freeze in place, leaving you with no course of action other than force closing the game. Another example pertains to switching masks. Unfortunately, I do not know what the cause is here, but the result is rather similar. You'll either be stuck with the same mask but be able to play normally otherwise, or you won't be able to do anything other than move, which of course calls for exiting and continuing. But let's say you have a high tolerance for jank. You can deal with all of these things because you want to unravel what Enotria has to offer in terms of lore. Well, for that you have one of the worst codexes I have ever seen. I'm not just talking about it being menus within menus, but rather I'm talking about its poor and honestly unappealing way of conveying information. Let's say you walk around and stumble across something interesting, like a dancing goober. What on earth could have possessed this young black man to dance? Surely the codex will shine light upon him specifically, or at least about this enemy type as a whole, right? Well, unfortunately, aside from some mundane text, you get nothing in terms of information in these codexes. Like, how am I supposed to know who I'm looking at when so many entries are derivative? Who is the Empress? Is this the Empress? Might be. Who is this guy? Who is that guy? The codex is very boneless for a game that wants to highlight Italian folklore. This is precisely one of those instances where you as a developer showcase the hard work the artists did on enemies by having their model present for the player's viewing pleasure, which would lay the ground to connect the dots and be like, ah, so the enemy I killed 5 gorillion times is insert name here. Cool. The "it's just an indie game" excuse won't fly here. Enotria was $50 at launch, the same price as Neo, yet its codex is not even a fraction in terms of quality presentation. Now Enotria costs $40, but its codex still can't even compete with the likes of Serious Sam: The First Encounter, a game older than some of you watching right now. As many of you might know, we love achievements around here. And sadly, I must say that Enotria The Last Song does not have a Get All Achievements achievement, which means game sucks. No, but seriously, from a completionist standpoint, Enotria has one great achievement called I Did Learn the Part, that has you defeating all the bosses while using their mask. This is a great incentive to go through an additional playthrough that you would have to go through anyways if you want to 100% Enotria. And it's also a great opportunity to experiment with builds and milk the combat for all it's worth. Since you already know who, what and where, the issue regarding elements I mentioned earlier is nullified, and thus the game becomes a sort of match the shapes, which is very enjoyable. From a different perspective on the completionist front, Enotria has the achievement Erudite, which has you completing the boneless codex of the game. A lot of the entries are obtained through defeating bosses and collecting notes throughout your journey. However, there are enemy-related entries that have you killing X amount of a specific enemy to get all 3 parts of their lore. Herein lies the issue. The enemies are not composed in a manner that would allow you to naturally get this by methodically clearing an area or by running through it a few times. Take for instance the Quinta Scuttler. To get to the 3rd lore entry for them, you need to kill 80. And there's only 3 of them in the most irrelevant corner by the 2nd bonfire you come across. There is absolutely no way to get this entry without a deliberate killing and resting cycle. This is by far the most anti-fun thing the game has to offer. Like, imagine falling in love with the Enotria universe and wanting to learn all about it, only to hear that you need to kill the same enemy 50 to 80 times for information. And don't think for a moment that the Quinta Scuttlers are an exception. No. They are the rule. The vast majority of enemies will require you to farm for 20 minutes, if not more, for some boneless text. 2 things that I didn't know where to squeeze in are one huge positive, which is the fluidity of combat, i.e. how smooth it feels to alternate between light and heavy attacks, which also extends to seamless continuity out of jump attacks. And one huge negative, which is the lack of voice acting. The first region is full of it. Even regular mobs will be throwing words your way. But as you pass into the second region, you'll have to start reading for pretty much every single NPC outside of a specific few.
Final chapter.
All in all, Enotria The Last Song is a very ambitious game with some pristine grass-fed meat hidden underneath patches of rotting skin. The game has a lot of beauty, but it is hard to focus on it when some bug, some bad enemy, some unpleasant design decision takes the spotlight. I believe this game is worth a genuine shot if it is on sale, which is why the final rating for Enotria The Last Song is a theatrical out of 10. That's about it. Don't forget to slap like, slap wife, it's Karuban.